The American Colonization Society was founded in 1816 by Reverend Robert Finley, a Presbyterian minister from New Jersey. Finley believed that blacks would never fully be accepted into white society, thus gave them the opportunity to migrate back to Africa where their ancestors were born. Finley believed that colonization would end slavery, so he and the ACS worked with the United States government to establish the African colony of Liberia in 1847. Liberia was specifically created to send African Americans who were fleeing the United States. By the time the American Civil War had started in 1861, 13,000 redeemed slaves and free blacks had settled in Liberia. However, with the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the Back to Africa movement declined. When Reconstruction ended and when the Jim Crow laws began in the 1870s, the movement opened back up, but to little effect. In the second half of the 19th century, much like the United States did to the Western migrators, the Republic of Liberia gave each family 25 acres of land in an attempt to entice more blacks to migrate to the African colony. In the United States, prior to 1876, the U.S. had more than 38,000 African Americans immigrate to Liberia. The state that took the largest hit was Arkansas, who saw almost 1,000 blacks leave. William Rogers, an Arkansan politician during the 19th century, had this to say regarding Liberia's statehood.
Liberia was the colored man's home, the only place on earth where they have equal rights.
Give thanks for roots and culture, a true and living soldier. Don't be that wanted poster, zombie minded fresh meat for the vulture. Walk like you're chosen. Selassie and Garvey. Walk like you're chosen. Like Grand Verb and Marley. Culture united, divided.
As Liberia declared independence from the ACS, and as the ACS sent its last blacks to Liberia in 1904, the ACS found itself doing less and less until it fell apart in 1964. However, during this time, an African American by the name of Marcus Garvey took the stage and headed a revised Back to Africa movement. Garvey was born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1887. When Garvey was 27, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. The association promoted black separatism and economic self-sufficiency, while its mission statement was to help the needy of the black race. Garvey's association was not very successful in its first 2 years, as there were only 200 members. 2 years after its founding, in 1916, the association headquarters was moved to Harlem, New York because Garvey was impressed with the black leadership there. Now in the US, Garvey and the UNIA were relatively successful. By the end of the calendar year in 1920, black restaurants were created. Black-only schools were created to educate the youth about black history. A newspaper is created called The Negro World and explained the positives and negatives about black culture on an international scale. In 1919, Garvey established a steamship line called the Black Star Line, which was operated and owned by blacks. These ships held goods for trade and helped blacks migrate back to Africa. Although there were only a few ships in the line, the establishment helped create commercial and industrial trade between blacks. Not only was there access to economic opportunity, but the dirty work regarding an end to colonialism could also be added to Garvey's resume. The 1920s are known as the Jazz Age and the Roaring Twenties. As World War I ended and the United States witnessed a new president in Mr. Warren Harding, the American economy prospered. The minimum wage increased every year from 1921 to 1927, and the Harlem Renaissance was in full effect. Garvey supported the Renaissance as he preached black pride, racial segregation, and a return to the Promised Land. Garvey, much like the ACS, believed that the only hope for blacks was to return to Africa. Unfortunately, although successful at times, the large white supremacy group overshadowed that of Garvey's. A majority of Garvey's supporters were lower-class blacks who had migrated from the South to the North during the Great Migration that accompanied World War I and its black veterans who followed. However, Garvey's power declined, beginning in the early 1920s because of the economic depression toward the end of the 1920s, and he faced criticism from other prominent civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph and W. E. B. Du Bois. In 1922, Garvey met with a KKK official, which was criticized as a deal made with the Klan to send blacks back to Africa. The fact that Garvey made peace with a white supremacist infuriated blacks across the world. The Black Star Line closed in 1922 due to bad business management. He was convicted of fraud in June of 1923 and was sentenced to 5 years in prison with a $1,000 fine. In 1927, President Calvin Coolidge deported Garvey back to Jamaica, where he died in obscurity in 1940. Garvey, over his lifetime, raised millions of dollars to finance blacks back to Africa and help spread the theory of Pan-Africanism to people around the world. Today, Garvey is still mentioned in schools and in art. Without the American Colonization Society and Marcus Garvey, blacks would have faced more racial discrimination and lived unsuccessful lives.